left off on Sunday morning in chapter 12 here in just a moment. When we get there, we're going to remind ourselves of the outline we're following for the book of Romans, and then we'll pick up there in chapter 12 in verse 9, and those list of a little bit more miscellaneous exhortations that are found in chapter 12. The book of Romans, we've been dividing down into two major sections that we've been looking at. There's the justification by faith through grace in 1 through 11, and then there is the application section that we began on Sunday morning in chapter 12, and that spans through the rest of the book. And so the first section is the more argumentative section, if you will, of the book of Romans, that we're justified by faith, and he's telling them of the fact that they need to, the fact that they're not justified by those deeds of the old law, having to deal with some questions that are raised really by those that are Jews in the first half of the book. And so he, in 1 through 3, reminds them that all of them need justification, whether Jew or Gentile. He reminds them in 4 through 8 that justification is not only needed by all, but it's been made available unto all. And that 9 through 11, that is the rejection of that, and that's the Jews' rejection of that. That's why the Jews are not saved and the Gentiles are. Not that they couldn't be, but they chose to reject the will of God. He then began, as we mentioned, in chapter 12, begins this application section, or living as a Christian section. Paul's writings typically have a section like this, where he would have in the first half or so, it's a little more than half in Romans, but he would have a more argumentative section dealing with some issue that he's addressing at these churches. And then he would have a section where he's giving them some exhortations or some practical application of it. Because of this, because you've been justified by faith through grace, here's how you need to live as Christians. Like Ephesians, all blessings are in Christ. Since all blessings are in Christ, here's how you need to live in Christ and walk worthy in the end of the book. So Romans is no different again. You're justified by faith through grace. Here's the practical application of that, or here's how you live because you've been justified in 12 through really 15. 16 is more just a closing section, but it's not enough to warrant its whole own part of an outline. And there are some closing greetings in there, some practical lessons we learn in that chapter 12. Chapter 12 is about our relationships. Chapter 12, we're going to see here, particularly later on, how we deal with our relationship to those that are Christians and our relationship to those that are not Christians. To those who would treat us well, and to those who are our enemies at the end of chapter 12. But on Sunday, we hit the first two sections, which is the first one is the exhortation to be a living sacrifice. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And so in 1 and 2, he reminded them of the fact that they needed to be that living sacrifice we talked about on Sunday, that being a Christian requires some sacrifice on our part, and it is demanded by God that we be willing to make sacrifices. And in making that sacrifice, and in verse 2, there's this one that makes the sacrifice is going to have to give up being like the world. Those that are to serve God are not to be conformed to the world, but be transformed. As we pointed out on Sunday, that word transformed is the word from which we actually get our word metamorphosis. And so the idea of changing form by the renewal of the mind. And that renewal of the mind is not a one-time thing that you have this renewal of the mind and then you're done, but it's something that has to constantly be worked on so that we remain holy or remain set apart and different. Otherwise, we can go to a time that we go back to being conformed to the world. It's then in verse 3 through 8 that he gives the exhortation to humility and service. He reminded them in verse 3 not to think too highly of themselves, but to think with sober judgment. And as we pointed out on Sunday, there's two aspects of humility. There's two aspects of this sober judgment. There's not thinking too highly of self. And then there's not thinking too lowly of self, as we pointed out on Sunday. Having a proper evaluation of oneself. That's what this sober judgment, that's what being humble really has, is not putting oneself down, but it's also not lifting oneself up. It's having that honest evaluation. He reminded them not to think more highly of themselves, because as he goes on to point out, they are all members of one body, though they may have different gifts. They all have different functions. And so as they have these different gifts, he lists here, he says, yet despite the different gifts, they are all still part of one body. As we pointed out, it's very similar to the point of 1 Corinthians chapter 12 as well, when Paul is having to deal there with the abuse of spiritual gifts. And we said that we need to remind ourselves that even though not everyone has the same gifts or talents, that everybody has a purpose. As we said, we sing a song sometimes, and Lord willing, planning on singing it during the singing, we are one, in which makes the point about how we're different. We fill different roles, but God's plan is fulfilled because we each have different roles that we fill. But when each part works together for the building up of the body, then those things are done. Not everybody may lead singing or deliver a sermon or lead in prayer, but there are different roles that each one fills. If you had a congregation where every man was a song leader, but that's all they could do, then you're not going to get very far with a bunch of song leaders but nobody to preach, or a bunch of preachers but nobody to encourage, or go on and so forth. And so each person has a role they can fill. It's then in verse 9 beginning that we're going to have the exhortations about the relationships to everyone. So there's really with our relationship to everyone, or in particular, we spent a lot of time making application of our relationship to our brethren, and in the latter part of that, in 17 to 21, is going to be our relationship to our enemies. But let's focus in on our relationship to everyone. And again, particularly, there's a lot of lessons we need to learn in this about our relationship to one another. Beginning at verse 9, let's read 9 through 16, and then we'll come back and discuss it. Let love be genuine. Abhor what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not be slothful in zeal, but fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in tribulation. Be constant in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints, and seek to show hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own eyes. So let's begin backing up now to verse 9. There's a list of several different exhortations, and depending on your translation, as you're following along with me as I was reading, you probably noticed yours said something, and some of them just a little bit different. So I've got in front of me the ESV, which is what I use, and the New King James, which is one of, if not the most common among brethren at this point. And we're going to talk about the two, and side by side, how they were each of these exhortations. The first exhortation in verse 9 is, the New King James says, let love be without hypocrisy, or the ESV says, let love be genuine. What does he mean by let love be genuine or without hypocrisy? What does that mean?
No camouflage.
Yeah.
Faking.
No, not a faking of love. You can remember that John would point out that it wasn't just loving in word, but it was to be loving in our deed as well. We don't want to be those that say, we love one another, but then we don't actually show it. That's why he says, little children, let us not love, 1 John 3:18, love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. It's not just saying it, it is a showing of it.
Well, and we don't say we love you, and then we go out and talk about that.
Right. And that's part of the letting love be without this hypocrisy.
Yes.
Is the word hypocrisy has the idea of one that is an actor. It's actually a Greek word that had to do for those that were actors on stage. And what is an actor's job? It is to play a character. It's to play a part of somebody that is not themselves, in most cases, right? If somebody's acting on stage, they're pretending to be something they're not. And that's the idea of hypocrisy here, is it's the one that is an actor. It's the one that they're acting like here's the one thing, but then in reality, here's the truth. For example, Jesus used this term to describe the Pharisees. Here are the Pharisees who were saying, listen, you don't need to do that, or you need to do this. And yet, as Jesus said, they were tying burdens on them. They were not willing to obey. Right? They were saying, here's what you need to do, but then they were not doing it. That's why he said, what they tell you to do it. They sit in Moses' seat, but they told people not to do as the Pharisees did. Right? They were being hypocritical. They were saying one thing, but they were just putting on an act. Well, the idea of letting love be without hypocrisy or genuine is not a facade of faking love, but truly having love for one another. And the word love here, as found in Romans chapter 12, is the word agape. So we talked about, there are two main words we talk about for love. We'll get to the other here later on. The first of those is the word agape or agapeo, depending on the form it's found in. And then the other is the word, does anybody know the other word? Agape and phileo. In fact, the form of that word is going to appear later on in the text. We'll get to that here in just a moment in verse 10. So, it's this agape kind of love. This love is the love that is said that God has. God is this agape or agapeo, again, same word, different form. That's the kind of love used to describe God. It's the kind of love one needs to have towards their enemies. Agape is often described as the love, as the foundational love. Phileo has more to do with the love of brotherly affection. Okay, so this agape love is the love that's constant. The others may change at times and not be always the same. The agape love is the love that is to be the constant. It is referred to as the, sometimes you probably heard preachers refer to it as the foundational love. And so, that's what the word love here is. That we're to have the agape kind of love, the one that seeks for the best interest of others. We're not to fake having that love, but to have that love and be genuine. Verse 9, let love be genuine, abhor what is evil. It's pretty straightforward. What's our reaction to the things that are evil, the things that are contrary to the will of God? We're to abhor, to detest it, to have a vehement dislike for, to hate strongly, the text says, of the word abhor. And so, that's the attitude. It's something that to us would be repulsive. We would turn from it when we see that which is evil. And the contrast, our reaction to that is disdain, but we are to cling to or hold fast to what is good. And so, it's the opposite when it comes to the things that are good. There's a clinging to, a holding on to. This word means to join closely together, to bind closely, or to unite. And so our attitude towards those things is this uniting, this clinging so closely to. It's something that should be always there with us, that we're holding on to tightly. So there's disdain for evil, there's clinging to what is good. There is now, verse 10, love one another with brotherly affection. And so again, there's this loving with brotherly affection mentioned in verse 10. So we come to a form of that word phileo. This is be kindly affectionate in some of them, Philadelphias, and then with brotherly love, Philadelphia. It's a form of the same word again. Now, Philadelphia probably sounds familiar. Sounds an awful lot like what city? Philadelphia, known as the city of brotherly love. It comes from this form, this word Philadelphia, meaning this brotherly love. So there's this brotherly love that is to be had in our relationship to one another. The literal sense is of the love for blood brothers or sisters. And our love for one another as Christians ought to be the same kind of love. It ought to be this kindly, affectionate love, the kind of love one may have towards those that are their blood siblings, to be the same for those that are siblings because of the blood of Christ, those that are adopted children as well. Yes?
Think about what Paul experienced in Acts chapter 20 when he was Miletus. He called down the Ephesian elders. Then he said, you're not going to see my face anymore. It says they fell on his neck, and they wept, and they kissed him or whatever. So I believe there's a demonstration of love. They didn't have to tell Paul after we love him. I think it was demonstrated by their actions. As you referenced in 1 John, I believe this, they weren't loving in tongue or in word, but rather their actions demonstrated that to Paul.
You're right, and there's lessons we can learn in that by that love being shown, and not just something that's talked about. Back to verse 10 now. So we have brotherly love. In the latter half of verse 10, the New King James says, "In honor give preference to one another." The ESV says, "outdo one another in showing honor." Now, the idea, as the ESV renders it, in outdoing one another is not the idea of competition. It's not, well, you're showing honor and I'm going to do better than you. But the idea of outdo or give preference, the Greek word means to go first and lead the way, or to be in a position of leadership. And so the idea of outdoing one another and showing honor is not you sit back and wait for the other person to do so, but you in that relationship need to take the lead. And so there's something here for all of us to learn. It's not just that we sit back and say, okay, well, when so-and-so does something. You ever heard that happen before? Well, as soon as so-and-so does their part. Sometimes you hear that about whether that's in the marriage relationship and a husband and wife, and one of them says, well, she says, as soon as he starts doing his part, I'll do mine. And then he says, well, as soon as she starts doing hers, then I'll do mine. And sometimes we have that same kind of attitude if we're not careful in our relationships with one another, to where we may sit back and may not even realize it, but we're sort of waiting on somebody else to take the lead. And the command we have is that we are to go first, or outdo one another, to take the lead in that relationship and showing honor. Verse 11, "Do not be slothful in zeal, but fervent in spirit." So don't be slothful in zeal. We talked a little bit about this word zeal the other day in our sermon about our worship. And we talked about this word zeal's definition, and how the idea here of the word zeal, according to the lexicographers, is this earnest communication of a discharge of an obligation or experience, a swiftness of movement or action, a haste of speed. It's the idea of a hurrying to in doing something. It's the idea of the excitement that goes with something and having this zeal. We come across this word zeal a lot of times in maybe different forms in the original language, but we talked about in chapter 10 those that were the Jewish people who had zeal, but not according to knowledge, right? They had sort of that burning desire. And the idea here is there's that excitement or burning desire, the hasten. If you're excited about something, you want to get to it, right? If you want to there's an excitement to get it done. And the idea of having this hasteness and this zeal is that there's this excitement when it comes to serving God, and we don't need to be slothful or slow in that. We need to not lagging in diligence, the New King James says, but instead we have this excitement about that relationship. Yes.
Think about Paul said, "Don't grow weary in well doing. In due season you will reap if you don't lose heart." So the point is, everyone, probably at different stages of their life, have more of this zeal, and sometimes it may lack. But we apparently need to have from the Holy Spirit the instruction not to grow weary or not to lose heart. And what's the motivation? Okay, we're going to reap if we don't lose heart. It's obvious if we draw back, God has no pleasure in us. But we need to not grow weary in well doing, and that's something that we have to be diligent in, because we don't have to work for our zeal to wane. We have to work for it not to wane.
You're right, and kind of we talked about on Sunday, we talked about our passion for worship and the zeal in worship and in any aspect of serving God. If we're all honest with ourselves, zeal, there are several things to zeal. Sometimes the strength of our faith. We probably like to think it was always getting better, but if we're honest with ourselves, there's probably a time it's more like a roller coaster, where, as Mike was saying, there's times it's sort of high, and then if we're not careful, it can come back down. There's the peaks, but then there's the valleys. And so he's reminding her not to lack or be slothful in that zeal, but instead be fervent in spirit. That word fervent is complete and total, would be the complete and total opposite of one that lacks that zeal. This word means to boil, to be stirred up emotionally or enthusiastically. And of course, we talked about on Sunday, we're not talking about uncontrolled emotion, but there does need to be that excitement and emotion in our service to God. And so the idea here is that this is one. Have you ever used this phrase, or heard somebody use this phrase, that they were on fire for the Lord? You know what that means? They were fervent in spirit. That's the idea. One that's on fire for the Lord, that is excited to serve Him.
That happened to us individually. We were collecting with one church in Revelation, can't recall which one. They had grown lukewarm or whatever like that. So that can happen, like I said, as an individual, or that can happen collectively. And sometimes we may have an influence on other people if we don't have our zeal, or, lax in our commitment, whatever way you want to talk about that. It's demonstrated in different ways, and we can have that adverse effect. But then you think about, too, Paul said when he wrote the church of Philippi, because of his perseverance in spite of those who were trying to make his life more difficult, he said, many of the brethren much more bold to speak the word. So it's two-sided there. Zeal could be contagious, but a lackadaisical approach can also.
You're right, and that's exactly what happened to Laodicea in Revelation. That you're saying that it was lukewarm, that they weren't on fire for the Lord, but they weren't cold. It wasn't like they had completely turned their back on Him. It was more that they were sort of in the middle, and we're going to keep on going. I think that's the approach kind of the people of Malachi's day as well. Is I think there would be people that would be lukewarm. It wasn't we're going to give up on God, but it wasn't we're on fire for serving God. It was just it's a weird. We're going to do it, but there wasn't that fervent desire. They sort of viewed it as a burden, and because of that, they were a little bit more on that lukewarm side instead of giving up. So he tells us here to be fervent in spirit and serve the Lord. And I think those three go very closely hand in hand. Don't be slothful in your sin, or don't be lacking in diligence. Instead, be fervent in spirit in serving the Lord. So that's how we are to be in our relationship and serving God. Not just serving here. I think sometimes we talk about serving God, we have the idea of when we're in worship, when we're singing or praying or taking the Lord's Supper, but in our service to God outside these four walls, there needs to be the same fervent spirit and excitement about being a child of God and being able to share that good news with others. The fact that they too, like us, could be adopted as children. Verse 12 now, rejoice and hope. Be patient in tribulation, be constant in prayer. Again, these three go closely together. Rejoice and hope. Now, we talked already about what hope is. We're going back into chapter 5 about hope. And we looked at what hope was. It's often described as desire plus expectation. And so we have hope. We have the hope of going to heaven, to be with God forever. And what we should be doing is rejoicing in the fact that we have that hope. Rejoice in the fact that we have the home in heaven if we stay faithful to God. Rejoice in the fact that we have the opportunity to go there because of the sacrifice of Christ. It's because of His sacrifice, as Romans 5 pointed out, that we have hope. Because while we were helpless, He died for us. And so we need to be rejoicing in the hope we have.
And the circumstances that we find ourselves on a daily basis can't take this rejoicing away, because it's the perspective of eternal life. Because we know Paul, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he's going through all these things or whatever like that. Yet here he is writing rejoicing in hope, and he says our light affliction. You see what I mean? You see all those things that go. So the point is, the circumstances you may find yourself in at different points of life, maybe physical sickness or whatever it may be, that tend to drag us down. But if we're anchored in the Word, that we can rejoice and endure through those things.
You're right, and I think I've said it here before, sometimes we confuse two words that are closely connected but different, that is joy and happy. Happiness is dictated by outward circumstances. Joy is something that should be constant. I've used this illustration before. We can have the joy and rejoicing in our hope that we have a hope of heaven. And then you're working on putting a board up one day and you hit your finger. Are you very happy in that moment when you hit your finger with a hammer? Not very happy. Does that mean you've been deprived of your joy from serving God? No. And so sometimes we can confuse those two, joy and happiness, and that joy is something that always remains. That joy remaining in our hope is what helps with this next one, being patient in tribulation. The word patient, the Greek word rendered patient, means to maintain a belief or course of action in the face of opposition. To stand one's ground and hold out or endure. And again, there are many different forms of words that appear here, but the idea is you're staying that course of action. Philippians chapter 3. Philippians chapter 3, at the end there, Paul uses the illustration of running a race. I press toward the goal for the prize of the upward call. And Paul lists a series of things that are entitled in that. What it means to press toward the goal, by the pattern, running by the pattern that's before us. Forgetting the things that are behind us. Looking to those that can be examples and imitation. And one of those, that Paul continues into the first verse of chapter 4, I think, in which in verse 1 he says, stand fast. Now, standing fast and running a race doesn't seem to make sense. But I think the idea, as you think about standing fast in the illustration of running a race, is stay in your lane. Right? You ever seen it where they're running the race here in the Olympics? And I can remember several years ago there was a race where a person won and then upon review lost the gold medal. Because even though they finished first, they sort of swerved out of their lane and just barely crossed into somebody else's lane. And by just barely crossing that line and running the race, they were disqualified. And the idea of standing fast is being firm. When you're running the race, you need to, and running by the rules, you've got to stay in your lane, right? Now, according to Matthew, there's only two options. It's either the path that leads to life or the path that leads to destruction. And if we swerve off the path that leads to life, everything else is the path that leads to destruction. And so,
but we can come back to the heart.
yes, we can come back to the path.
But those runners can't do that.
Right. We can come back, unlike those, the runner that can't go back and rerun the gold medal race. But the idea of being patient and staying the course, staying in the lane, that is staying within the confines of this right here, living by this right here in our service to God. So we stay the course even in the face of opposition or in the face of tribulation, as it says here. We're constant in prayer. I think of the passage in 1 Thessalonians, rejoice always and pray without ceasing. Prayer is to be a constant part of the life of a Christian. Verse 13, contribute to the needs of the saints, seek to show hospitality, contributing to the needs of the saints, and given the hospitality, help those that are in need. Particularly here, he mentions help those that are in need of brethren. And then given the hospitality, or the idea again is to seek to show hospitality. Again, we talked about outdoing one another. Sometimes we could wait for opportunities to present itself, but the idea here is to go on the hunt for, or to seek out the opportunities in showing the hospitality. Again, showing the taking of the lead in that relationship.
Paul said, look not every man his own interest, but look on the interest of others. He said, let this heart be in you, which was in Christ Jesus also. There's the ultimate demonstration of the principle found here, because we needed a Savior. We needed salvation to keep us from the second death, the fires of hell. So what Jesus did, he didn't look at his own interest when he was coming down here and leaving the beauty of heaven. He was looking on our interest. And Paul said, that's the mind that needs to be in us. So the point is, to see things, you've got to be looking for some time. Like you said, if they just kind of struggle in your path, that may be one thing. but it's more like a diligent awareness of these situations, and not only being aware, but then addressing.
You're right. And so that's the end of there, again, hunting for, looking for those opportunities. Let's try to hit this. The last several verses go together, so let's try to hit these last few verses real quick. Verse 14, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them. Going back to the Beatitudes, it's not when somebody treats you poorly, when somebody persecutes you, that you have a bad attitude. In fact, our hope should be that that one who may be persecuting us may be one that learns the truth and actually responds in obedience, like Paul of Tarsus or Paul. Verse 15, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. I think this again shows the close-knit relationship we ought to be having with one another. When you're close to somebody and they're happy, then you're typically happy for them. But if they're sad, you sorrow with them. And that ought to be our relationship to one another, that when one is rejoicing or one is weeping, that we share with them in that and are there for them. Verse 16, live in harmony with one another, or be of the same mind toward one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly, never be wise in your own sight. There's living with harmony. We've talked before, there's unity and there is peace. And this harmony, or having the same mind, is going to require both. First, the unity, which is we're all believing and practicing the same thing. But then, being in harmony, there will be the peace, not letting small or petty things stand in the way and affect our relationship to one another. We don't become haughty, but instead associate with the lowly and every wise in our own sight. That's closely connected to what we saw back in verse 3 of the same chapter about our attitude that we have. 17 through 21. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink, for by so doing you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. The idea in 17 through 21 is about not being one whose attitude is about retaliation towards those who do evil to us. Again, verse 14, when somebody persecutes us, we shouldn't curse them, but we should bless them. When one does evil to us, our idea should not be, what can I do to get them back? In fact, that's the opposite of the golden rule. The golden rule, kids like to say, do unto others as they do it, but it's do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And the golden rule demands that we do to them what we would want them to do to us. And so we don't repay them evil. As far as it depends on us, live peaceably with all. Can we always live peaceably with every person on earth? No, but it better not be because of us.
Diotrephes, he wanted to have the preeminence. It was very destructive to the church there, you know what I'm saying? But also, I was thinking about this paying people back. Paul wrote to the church of Thessalonica, I think it was in the second letter. He said, it's a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation those who trouble you. There should be a big term for me to mistreat you. I mean, it should be because I love you, I shouldn't mistreat you. But there's a secondary thing too. God's going to repay me with tribulation if I trouble you.
You're right, and that should remind us of not repaying one another. Verse 19 should as well. Ultimately, vengeance belongs to God, and He will repay. Verse 20, real quick, I want to hit something here. If your enemy's hungry, you feed him. If he's thirsty, you give him something to drink. Basically, you do good to them. And even if they're not doing good to you, you do good to them. By so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Now, that doesn't mean our attitude, this is what I wanted to hit real quick, is I'm going to do this, and by so doing, it's heaping coals on his head, hot coals on his head. That's just a result of what we're doing, is it might make them realize what we're doing and having the right relationship to them and treating them right may cause them to realize, you know what? I've not been what I need to be. Our intention is not to heap coals of fire on their head, but our intention is to get them to see the truth and change. And so we don't have again, it goes back to that attitude. We have the right attitude and how we go about and motivation behind why we do the right thing. Lord willing, we'll pick up in chapter 13 and talk about our relationship to the government on Sunday.